everyone, welcome to class. In today's lecture, it's going to be the last of our online lectures. We will be moving in person after reading week. Let's all take a moment to celebrate. So today we are going to cover the last of our families of neuropeptides. This is oxytocin and vasopressin. So these are ones you've probably heard of. These are peptide hormones of the posterior pituitary gland, the only hormones of that posterior pituitary gland. It's very exciting. So let's move into it. I guess a side note, remember that your lay summary is due today. So hopefully you're watching this on the 18th when it's due and not the day after, and realize. Moving on. So, oxytocin comes from the Greek words oxy and tokos, which means quick birth. Fun facts. So, it is one of only two hormones released from that posterior pituitary gland. Most other hormones are secreted from the anterior pituitary gland. Pretty much all of the others. So, oxytocin was first described in 1906, so very early, one of the first peptides that we knew about. Of course, then it was more just as a hormone, not as a neuropeptide, but it was described as a compound that's able to elicit uterine contractions. So it's actually been used in a role of labor and pregnancy and post-pregnancy with lactation. So it was identified and synthesized in 1953, and one of the scientists that identified it, isolated it, was Vincent du Vigneaud, and he got a Nobel Prize for it. So yay for more old white guys. I mean, he looks nice, but who knows? So, this is vasopressin. It is a cyclic nonapeptide, so it does look different than other peptides. One big one being that it's cyclic rather than just a long line of peptides. All right. This is vasopressin. Vasopressin is a cyclic nonapeptide. Now, vasopressin is related to oxytocin. We're going to talk about them both. But vasopressin is also known as arginine vasopressin, or arginine vasopressin, however you pronounce that. So AVP is vasopressin. And then it's also known as antidiuretic hormone, or ADH. That is also vasopressin. And it's also known as arginpressin. Okay, so it has multiple names. We're calling it vasopressin. But for abbreviations, the two most popular are AVP or ADH. I'll mostly be using AVP. So when you see AVP, know that means vasopressin. So it functions principally as a vasoconstrictor and antidiuretic. So it helps modulate water channels in the kidneys to increase water reabsorption. So pretty much it helps make sure that the water gets removed from our poop so we don't have diarrhea. That's really what vasopressin is doing. It's not pretty, but it's very helpful. It is an important regulator of water then, but also of glucose and salt homeostasis. So it helps make sure that our gut is balanced, that we don't have too much salt, not enough salt, etc., and same with glucose. Now, these variations of vasopressin is found in mammals, so particularly in marsupials and then pigs and hippos. They have a lysine residue at position 8. I'll point that out in a second. Which makes the distinction between our arginine vasopressin and lysine vasopressin. So the arginine right here, instead of that in these mammals, marsupials, pigs, hippos, etc., they will have a lysine right here. But otherwise, it acts the same. It's pretty much the exact same thing, okay? But what's weird is that non-mammal vertebrates, so like reptiles and birds, they have an arginine at position 8. So it's weird. So if you're wondering, it's most likely that arginine was the original one. So we still have the original vasopressin. And then in a few species, then it started to evolve with tyrosine instead of arginine, or sorry, lysine instead of arginine. And it's just happening. Who knows why? But it's working for them. So, do you need to know that? No, but I thought it was fun. Moving on. So now let's combine oxytocin and vasopressin. So both of these are expressed on two separate prepropeptide genes. So there's the oxytocin gene and the AVP gene or vasopressin gene. Okay. We then have cleavage of these prepropeptides lead to polypeptides, which give rise to oxytocin and vasopressin, and additional carrier protein. Okay, so this additional carrier protein is neurophysin from oxytocin, then you get neurophysin 1. From pre-pro vasopressin, you get neurophysin 2. Okay. Bold, maybe know those. So these neurophysins function as carrier proteins for peptide hormones. Okay. So they help facilitate the distribution of oxytocin and vasopressin to make sure that they aren't being broken down before they get to their target areas. Because remember that peptides get broken down very quickly in the system. So we need to be able to move them around the body, around the central nervous system, without them getting broken down before they can do their thing. And that's what carrier proteins do. So they help extend that half-life, help prevent them from being broken down or becoming inactive before they can do their thing. So, where do we find these? Again, posterior pituitary gland. So, neurohypophyseal peptide hormones. What a mouthful. But oxytocin and vasopressin are synthesized in secretory neurons within the hypothalamus. Okay, so here's the hypothalamus. And they project to that posterior pituitary gland. The only two hormones that do. Oxytocin and vasopressin will then be released into circulation, particularly that hypophyseal portal system. Okay. So here you can see this one is a paraventricular cell or paraventricular nucleus, and you can see that the oxytocin cell starts there and then moves down and releases its stuff. And then here we've got the supraoptic nucleus of the hypothalamus, where the vasopressin cell starts out and then it goes to that posterior pituitary. Now, what you'll see is that the two hormones are acting on the systemic venous flow. Okay, so here you can see where we get the arterial inflow into the pituitary and then the outflow. Okay, and so here we're seeing that vasopressin then flowing out of that artery, out of the posterior gland, to then go throughout the body. How fun. So what are the roles of these hormones? Wonderful. We've got oxytocin. Oxytocin stimulates uterine contractions during childbirth. So when you're getting cramps, when you're giving birth and it hurts, thank you, oxytocin, for that. Oxytocin also helps stimulate the milk letdown in response to suckling in lactating mothers. So it's what allows the milk to actually leave the milk ducts and go to the nipple and leave the nipple. And again, that is in response to suckling. It binds to a single receptor, the OXTR, so oxytocin receptor, beautifully named. It is a GQ receptor, okay? So it modulates. It's also proposed to play roles in various human behaviors, most of which we will talk about, because after this slide, we're focusing just on oxytocin. We're going to cover autism spectrum disorder and the role of oxytocin. That's going to be one of the last things we talk about today. But we're also going to talk about oxytocin in terms of social bonding and trust and arousal and things like that, as well as these maternal behaviors and how it interacts with other human behaviors and emotions. Vasopressin helps regulate the homeostasis of glucose, water, and salts. Great, we talked about that. We see it a lot in those kidneys. It's very important. Decreased vasopressin function causes diabetes insipidus. Yep. So we can get high blood sodium levels. We can see excess urine production and excess thirst. All things that you can see in someone with diabetes if their blood sugar is not properly regulated. Or in an animal. One of my cats growing up had diabetes, and we always knew when he wasn't feeling good, when he would experience especially polyuria and polydipsia. These are two big symptoms that we would see in our cat when we would then have to take him to the vet and alter stuff. In case you're wondering. There are 4 different receptors for vasopressin. 2 of them are in the central nervous system. The other 2 are in the periphery, so especially in the kidneys. So vasopressin 1A and 1B are the 2 that are in the central nervous system, and they are also GQ coupled receptors. And then the ones in the periphery are just vasopressin 2 and 3. Also G-coupled protein receptors, because that's what we do with neuropeptides, right? Exactly. Okay, so I hope you are good with vasopressin. Again, just know it's one of the 2 hormones from the posterior pituitary gland. Know that it helps regulate the homeostasis in the kidney of water, glucose, and salts. You're pretty much good. And then oxytocin, we will move on and talk about it some more. So we're going to have just one last slide in this video talking about oxytocin, and then in the next video we'll start talking about the oxytocin systems. So oxytocinergic neurons, so oxytocin neurons, project from that paraventricular nucleus of the hypothalamus to the forebrain and the hindbrain. Okay. So these are areas. See, so that's where it's getting the oxytocin. Or here's the whatever. It's so the hippocampus is getting oxytocin. The VTA is getting oxytocin. Pituitary getting oxytocin. Awesome. And other areas as well. So forebrain and hindbrain. We see it a lot in the amygdala, very important for emotions. We see it in the nucleus accumbens. We see it in the VTA and the hippocampus. All of these are areas we've talked about before, or you should have talked about in other classes, that are connected to emotions, connected to bonding, that kind of thing. So it really makes sense that that's why we are getting oxytocin in these areas, and why oxytocin is playing a role in modulating those areas. So again, let's end this video here. In the next video, we'll start talking about oxytocin systems and what it does.